Today, Talmud for Everyone welcomes Yair Furstenberg, who is the Louis Ginsberg Professor of Talmud at the Talmud Department of the Mendel Institute for Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Furstenberg's work focuses on the history of early rabbinic literature and law within its Greco-Roman context. In his publications, he examines the emergence of Jewish legal discourse during the Second Temple period, as well as its relationship to the Jesus traditions. Today, Talmud for Everyone is delighted and honored to facilitate a discussion about Furstenberg's new book, Purity and Identity in Antiquity, From the Temple to the Mishnah, which was recently revised, translated, and published in English by Indiana University Press. And as always, we're going to provide links below the boxes to our recordings on our YouTube channel so that you can have access to the cutting-edge research of our distinguished guests. Yair, thank you so much for generously sharing your time and expertise for this segment called Two Scholars and a Talmud with Talmud for Everyone. I finally had the occasion to meet. We finally met at Boston at the Society of Biblical Literature, American Academy of Religion last year, and I'm delighted we can have this conversation together today.
Thanks, Isaac. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to study together.
In fact, I've been following your work for quite a while. We were both surprised we had not met before. Just as an anecdote, I think the first time I discovered your work was through Daniel Boyarin, who was on my dissertation committee. Back in 2011, 2012, thereabouts, he wrote this book, The Jewish Gospels, and in there was really heavily drawing and depending on your work on hand washing and your analysis of Mark for his book. And so that's where your name came to my consciousness, and ever since I've been following your book. Following your works. So, in fact, your book, which was published first in Hebrew, but now is accessible to a much wider audience, now that it's in English, traces this development of Jewish views on purity and how they were practiced during the Second Temple period and early rabbinic periods. So just for our audience, we have people here who might not know what is the Second Temple period. I'll just say quickly, this is roughly from about 515 BCE, give or take, when the Jews are granted permission to come back from Babylonia under the decree of Cyrus to rebuild the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians, so Second Temple. And this period extends all the way to at least 70 CE, when the Romans destroy the Second Temple. Some specialists would say, actually, since there's still an expectation for the rebuilding of the temple until the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to about 135 CE, that the Second Temple period could be extended all the way to that period. So that's what we mean when we're saying Second Temple period for 5-6 centuries, an extensive time. And then the early rabbinic period, which basically, let's say, starts after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. So your work is tracing the Jewish views on purity and how they're practiced during these periods. And a notable feature of your book is its sustained attempt to reconstruct the Pharisaic approach. So the Pharisees, how they related to purity matters through a careful, very detailed consultation of pre-rabbinic sources, so writings from the Second Temple period, but also early rabbinic sources. Before we get into the thorny, detailed issues involved in this reconstruction, I'd like to ask just a simple question for our audience. Who were the Pharisees?
It sounds like a simple question.
Yeah. After saying that, it's like, that's not an easy question, actually.
Yeah. Just one sentence before I get into this specific issue. My book and my work in general focuses on both the Pharisees belonging to the Second Temple period and then the rabbis after the Second Temple period. And here we're in a basic methodological problem. We have two groups living in supposedly in different periods, and each of them have a completely different set of sources relating to them. Now, the thing is that in order to understand the rabbis that are emerging in 70 CE, or maybe even earlier, and I'll talk about that later, and the Pharisees, who are a dominant group among Second Temple period, right? We need to link these two group of texts. We need to find ways to create this story, to extend the story from one period to another, because for very, I would say, curious reasons, the break is so total. It's like we're looking at two completely different pictures, and as historians, trying to understand what are the roots of the rabbis, where do they take their ideas, what was the influence of the Pharisees. On the other hand, how much Judaism that came after 70 CE is actually Pharisaic Judaism, or is Rabbinic Judaism something new? This is a big, big question in our understanding of Judaism. I mean, the whole root Judaism took from then until now, right? How much is Pharisaic Judaism, or the Pharisaic policy or way of life, in a core for Jewish thought, beliefs, practices until in much later? And that depends on the question of the continuity. But we have a problem because there's no one source that really gives us the full story. So what I try to do is fill the gaps and create a continuous story. And my book, therefore, is divided into two parts, and we'll start from the Pharisees, and later on we'll roll into the rabbis and the relationship to their Pharisaic roots. And who are the Pharisees? So that really depends who you ask, because we have many sources. You can even say too many sources about the Pharisees in Second Temple period. Okay, so let's go source by source and see very briefly what it tells us about the Pharisees. The first source one should use, I think, is Josephus, the historian. He mentions the Pharisees since the period of the Hashmonaim, the Hasmonean dynasty, about at the mid-2nd century BCE, 150 BCE. At that point, that's the first time that he mentions the Pharisees, but he mentions them together with the two other sects, the Essenes and the Sadducees. So Josephus provides some kind of a framework for Jewish movements and Jewish philosophy through these three groups, and the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Sadducees. And this group is active, these groups, I should say, are active until his own days. He lived at the end of the Second Temple period. Right? He saw the revolt. He saw the destruction of the temple. So we're talking about 200 years of these groups active, and Josephus himself says that he tried all of them. He wanted to decide what kind of way of life to choose, so he checked the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Sadducees. He was a priest, so he had the privilege to do that. At the end, he says he went back to the Pharisaic way of life. His Greek there is not completely clear in his book, The Life of Joseph. So one thing we can say about them, first thing, that this is a long period, and we must assume that a movement along 200 years did not stay the same.
Mhm.
And another thing is that you can choose to join it, at least that's the way Josephus presents it, and that it's a relatively popular way of life within Jewish society, because Josephus seems to be preferring this upon other practices. So what do we know from Josephus about this Jewish, what he calls philosophy or sect? He could say, I would say, two main things. One thing is their obligation to, or maybe I'd say three things, excuse me. One thing is their obligation to the tradition of the elders. So this is a point that he stresses that they are not only obligated to the Torah, to the written scripture, like the Sadducees, but they have another source of normative commitment, and that is tradition. And it's very interesting why it's where this idea comes from, but it becomes, as Josephus says, a point of contention between the groups, because how do you allow yourself to prefer sometimes tradition over the simple meaning of the Torah, right? And the Sadducees were committed only to the Torah and to its interpretation. So that's one thing. The second thing is that he says that they're very precise interpreters of the Torah. So they're learned, they know how to interpret the Torah, and they do it very precisely. Now, it's interesting that the word Pharisee, maybe you should say something about the name itself. The word Pharisee when you read Josephus, it seems to be that he derives the word Pharisee from the Hebrew word perush, interpretation. But I would say that that is not the original meaning. The original meaning is perush in the sense of someone who separates himself from others. So it's separate, and we'll see that regarding their purity practices. So they're a form of a sect. Josephus doesn't talk in those terms. It's very important. I think he tries to minimize these aspects of the Pharisees, but also the Pharisees have some element of sectarianism. They don't come in contact with others. They're elite, and as an elite, they make sure to separate themselves from others. We'll get to that point later on. Now, a third element of the Pharisees. So we spoke about tradition, we spoke about interpretation, and the third element is more philosophical, theological, because Josephus stresses these aspects when he describes the differences between the different groups, and he says that the basic features of Pharisaic philosophy, I would say two things. One is the belief in resurrection, that the body returns to the soul returns to the body. Each of the sects has a different view regarding life after death. The Sadducees don't believe at all in life after death. They're very traditionalist. That's actually probably the view of the Torah itself, of scripture. The Essenes have a more Platonic view of the soul, and the Pharisees, for some reason, have their way to solving issues through this reconstruction of this situation of the resurrection of the body. And we know that from New Testament that Paul is a Pharisee, is a strong Pharisee exactly in this respect. Mm-hmm. Another aspect of the Pharisees, philosophical aspect, is the fact that they believe that God is responsible both for good things and for bad things. Now, that is a basic or very contentious issue because, for instance, the Essenes or the people of Qumran have a much more dualistic worldview. They're not willing to attribute to God anything bad, so they have a very complicated system of a good spirit and a bad spirit, and these spirits that rule the world, and God is beyond these things. But the Pharisees strongly believe in that God is responsible for everything, and you have to bless Him both for the good things and for the bad things. That Josephus is. So that is Josephus. That's one aspect of Josephus. Another aspect, after Josephus describes the three sects, he adds another element, and that is the political involvement of the Pharisees. The Pharisees during the Hashmonean period were very much involved in politics, and we won't go into details. In the beginning, they didn't like them, and then they liked them, and then they went back and forth. But at some point, and this is maybe most important, at about the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, they were in their strongest position politically, and the Queen Alexandra, the wife of Alexander Yanai, she took them to be in charge of the court systems, and they were very much involved in ruling. But that is a unique point, because usually from that point on, we see they're less and less involved in politics. We don't see, once we move from the Hasmonean period to Herod, to the rule of the Herodian, Herod and his family. So they are much less involved. They're not a force to themselves. They try to fit into the new politics, but you cannot find, and this is very important, you cannot find a Pharisaic political approach. What you find during the Hashmoni and the Pharisees is like a party. It's a political party, and they could make people go against the king and fight against. And there are stories that we know about that. In the Herodian period, they break down into very different political views. So it includes also the rise of new groups that Josephus calls the fourth philosophy. That the fourth philosophy, the Zealots, he says there are a branch of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees now don't have any power to define like a clear political approach, and you have very different practical approaches among them. So what connects them is less the political approach, the relationship with the governing power, but much more their religious and legal approaches. And this is something that we find in later sources. So now we move from Josephus to the next source, which I would say the Gospels. So if we're in a few sentences, what do we know about the Pharisees from the Gospels? So we know, like Josephus, that they believe in resurrection. We know also from the Gospels, like Josephus, that they're a popular, I would say, movement. But now we know also, and this is something that Josephus doesn't really talk about, their specific legal sensitivities. They really care for specific legal matters. And in the Gospels, we see what they care for. For instance, they supervise Shabbat, right? Whether people are observing Shabbat or not, the Sabbath, right? They have an approach regarding divorce, right? Josephus discusses it. They're lenient regarding the possibility to divorce. They have their very specific legal views, and they care for hand washing. Now here we reconnect again to Josephus, because hand washing is just in Mark 7, is defined as based on tradition of the elders. Again, that is exactly what they care for. So the Torah, the Bible itself, doesn't say anything about hand washing. But for some reason, the Pharisees, and I'll try to explain that later on, developed this additional practice of hand washing, and they really care for it. And they come and question Jesus why his disciples don't wash your hands. But why should they wash your hands? It's not in the Torah. So the Sadducees would not care about that, but the Pharisees care about tradition. So this is one aspect of the dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees. So they care about the law. They have their own specific approach to law, which includes tradition, but also includes all kinds of details, which we'll get to it later on. And what we know from the Gospels is that they persecuted Jesus. So it depends, of course, what gospel we're reading and according to what version, but on the whole, maybe we'll say they're the opponents of Jesus. That's accepted in all of the Gospels. And what exactly they did to Jesus, that depends on the specific version. Okay? So
that's very good. Yeah, we'll get back to Jesus and the Pharisees, because like you said, the Pharisees begin as, let's say, a political party. Sometimes it's hard to divide politics from religion in antiquity. It's almost artificial, but they have political clout. Josephus, who's a precious source of information for the Second Temple period, for our audience, was a Jewish historian, a Jewish writer from the 1st century CE. who lived through the Jewish-Roman War that occurred around 66 to 74 CE. So he was even part of the revolt, fought the Romans, then got caught by the Romans, and then was an eyewitness of what happened, the siege to Jerusalem. He wrote about this. He wrote Jewish history. He was a Jewish priest, as you said. And he talks about the Second Temple period a great deal and mentions the Pharisees as emerging, or the first references to the time when the Hasmoneans, a Jewish dynasty, Jewish rulers, kings, who had established a certain kind of autonomous kingdom for Jews in Judea from around after the Maccabees fought the Greeks, 167 to 164 BCE. The Pharisees emerge around this time, or at least they're mentioned for the first time at this period as very politically active, politically influential. However, once we get to the Herodians, like you said, King Herod the Great, who is mentioned in the New Testament, the Pharisees, they're not as politically influential, and they seem to now be more involved with what we call religion, to be very influential in that domain. And there are three things that you mentioned right about them. So there's this tradition of the elders. Seems to be an extra biblical corpus of authoritative teachings that the Pharisees uphold. They have a very particular approach to the scriptures, precise, accurate approach, as it's called, something along those lines. And then there's this some theology, the belief in the resurrection, notably, as something that also the New Testament mentions as something the Pharisees believe in. Paul himself was a Pharisee, and that probably helps us understand why he believed in the resurrection of Jesus. As somebody who already believed in the resurrection, that made it easier to believe that somebody could rise from the dead. So we'll come back to this because you were able to say a great deal about the Pharisees. But your work also deals with this hyphenation, which you mentioned at the opening of your talk, Pharisees and rabbis. It has
Isaac,
been,
just
yeah.
before we move on to the rabbis,
Go ahead.
there was another source that I have to mention because I think it will give us some better perspective. Josephus likes the Pharisees, or he is associated, he's close to the Pharisees. The Gospels on different levels oppose the Pharisees because of their role in the story of Jesus. Now, another group that we have to take in consideration is the Qumran sectarians. Now, just for the sake of brevity, Qumran sectarian are generally associated with the Essenes that we mentioned before, but we have their library that was found in the Judean desert. You can see it behind me, exactly pointing towards the caves of Qumran, where we found their amazing library. So in that library, they never say Pharisees explicitly because they're very secret. But when you decipher their writings, it's clear, and there's also overlap with Josephus' story. So we can really clarify. There is one group that they despise is the Pharisees. Why does they despise them? Mainly for legal issues, because the Pharisees, the name of the Pharisees in Qumran is the seekers of smooth things. That means that they're lenient. They're trying to make life easy. So the people of Qumran say, look, we can't live in Jerusalem because the level of observance here is not serious. We can't participate in the temple because probably the policy of the Pharisees is governing the practices of the temple. So the temple is impure in our view. The temple is desecrated. Right? So the Qumran, who are extremists, they're the extreme form of sectarianism, feel that they have to separate themselves from the people of Israel. They call themselves Pushim. We are separating. We're going to the desert because the Pharisees are having enough power, at least, if not politically, so at least in their legal policy. And the practices here are just too lenient, and we can't stand it. So they have other bad things to say about them, but you can really see it's very important to emphasize this because maybe some are used to view the Pharisees as very strict, as very, very stringent about their legal views. So at least some of Jewish groups view
Right.
them exactly the opposite. And the fourth source, we won't, that's just to introduce your question. The fourth source is rabbinic literature, which also mentions the Pharisees.
Yeah, right. So basically, from the Second Temple period, we've got three major sources. We have Josephus, we have the writings, some of the writings that are now in the New Testament, Gospels. We can include Paul too, because he was a Pharisee. The Acts of
Correct.
the Apostles, that's where actually the belief in the resurrection by the Pharisees is made explicit when Paul's on
Mhm.
trial in Jerusalem and he sees the Pharisees and Sadducees. He says, I'm here because I'm a Pharisee. And then that leads to a dispute between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But we also have some of these documents that were discovered in these caves at a site near Qumran, the caves near Qumran in the Judean desert that contain writings. Some of the writings were written by what is believed to have been a sect, perhaps associated with the Essenes, and they refer not explicitly by name to the Pharisees, but it seems to be like the Pharisees that they're condemning for their teachings or their legal interpretation of the Torah. Um, so speaking about the rabbis, right, and something you already introduced a bit at the beginning, it is quite common, or it has been common, to associate Pharisees with rabbis, or to think of the rabbis that are mentioned in the Talmud in early rabbinic literature from the same period as the Talmud, as being the spiritual descendants or successors of the rabbis. However, as you well know, and this is more a question for our audience, of course, in recent decades, modern scholarship has questioned that assumption, noting, among other things, that the rabbis in the classical rabbinic literature, so we're talking Talmud, Mishnah, etc., they rarely identify as or identify with the Pharisees. So what's your take on this controversial question? What is the relationship between the Pharisees and the rabbis after 70 CE?
Yeah, so maybe I'll distinguish between they identify with the Pharisee, they're not identified as Pharisees. Okay, so this would be the distinction, and this is a very important point. Um, Again, how do we check the relationship between these two groups? I'm returning to the point I raised in the beginning,
Mhm.
right? We have rabbinic literature. Now, maybe I'll say a few words about the text, the
Right.
rabbinic literature itself, right? Rabbinic literature is the traditions, right? Beginning from the Mishnah and other early rabbinic sources. We have Mishnah, we have Tosefta, we have the Talmud, but all of these are actually group of traditions that brought together and redacted in a gradual process. So when we talk about Mishnah, we talk about Mishnah as the first rabbinic text, but we have to remember the Mishnah, we can say, was redacted about 200 CE by Rabbi Judah the Patriarch. Now, that's clear.
Mhm.
But this is actually the end of a long process. So the fact that the text was redacted at 200 doesn't mean that it doesn't have earlier layers to it, including layers referring to rabbis of the end of the first century. Let's take the most famous example, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. This is a famous sage, he's known for this story, probably not a historic story, but it represents his role in when he fled Jerusalem during the siege of the Romans, and he asked the Vespasian to allow him to reestablish or establish a center for rabbis in Yavne, Jamnia, what we call. Now, this is not a historical story, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is clearly a major figure in this first generation of rabbis after the destruction of the temple. So we have, and he appears, we don't have his own writings, we have his tradition that appeared in a text that was redacted 100 years plus later in the Mishnah. And in the Tosefta and the Talmud, we have these texts. Now, if I take one text of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, for example, it appears, you can check later, it appears in a tractate, one unit of the Mishnah, we call them tractates, one unit in this order of purities called Yadayim, talking about laws of hand and purity. And there we have a discussion that appeared, a quotation of a discussion between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And that discussion is commented by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And so when we read the source closely, we see that on the one hand, they're presenting a debate between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The issue is, do the Holy Scriptures defile the hand? Very, very interesting question. For some strange reasons, the Pharisees thought that if you touch a Holy Scripture, let's say you're holding the scroll of the Torah, you're holding it, then your hands are defiled. If it's very strange, the scroll of the Torah is holy. How can it defile? I mean, holy things are not supposed to defile, right? That's, I would say, exactly the opposite, right? So that's a very strange thing. And indeed, the Sadducees complain. They say, woe to you, Pharisees, for you think this strange thing that the Holy Scripture, defile the hands. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, again, this rabbi, he's not a Pharisee. He doesn't say that he's a Pharisee. He comments and he discusses this source with his disciples. And he says, look, this is really strange. The Sadducees are right. But is that the only thing that is strange about the laws of the laws of the rabbis, of the Pharisees? Sorry, I'll give you another example of something that is strange. For instance, the bones. He brings another example of a paradoxical laws of the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were known for their paradoxes. For instance, according to the laws of the Pharisees, a bone of a high priest, like any other person, defiles. But a bone of an animal does not defile. That doesn't make sense, right? You would expect that the more profane the thing is, like he says, the bone of an ass, to give you the feeling of a profane thing. The bone of the ass does not defile. I would expect exactly the opposite.
Especially since the donkey is an impure animal, right?
Exactly. That's very important to say. So how do you? And then he offers an explanation. He says there's a practical reason for that. What's the practical reasons? In order. So why are the bones of the high priest and humans defiled? In order that people will not use them for cutlery. So use the bone of it. So the bone of the animal I want you to use. That's a good. You need to use it. Those are the materials that you have. But bones of people were afraid that will be abused, so we're defiling them. Now, is that the right explanation or not? That's besides the point. I won't go into those details. But what do we see here from this short story? We see a tradition regarding a dispute between Pharisees and Sadducees, quoted by a rabbi, who's named a rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, discussing this source with his students. Now, on the one hand, he does not identify as a Pharisee. He's not part of the discussion. Other scholars read it differently. That's the way I read it. He's not part of the discussion. He's referring to this discussion because it's an older discussion. But at the other hand, he identifies with the position of the Pharisees because he wants to explain it. And here comes the most important point. Sociologically, we're talking about two different groups, and maybe I'll try to explain later why it happened. But when you check the legal contents of rabbinic views, their philosophical views, they always, 100% of the time, follow Pharisaic approaches. So in this case, they accept the legal views of the Pharisees concerning purity and impurity. Or another example, a famous example of a water stream. A water stream is let's say take a pipe, right? Connected between you have water pools on one place, and then you have a pipe leading to a smaller pool or to your sink, right? Whatever. Now, what happens if you have a dead animal in your sink, right? So it's explicit in Qumran in a text called Miktzat Ma'aseh Torah, a few words of the Torah, which presents all the complaints of these Qumran sectarians against this lenient practices. They explicitly say, if there's a stream of water, so even if the impure thing is at the end of the stream, it defiles everything above it.
Right.
And that is a crazy, that is a very extreme, I would say, result, because that means that if someone in his sink at his house opened the water, opened the tap, and touched something impure, all the water system is impure. So you have a whole city. You defile the whole city. Now the Pharisees say explicitly the opposite. In the Mishnah, in the same Mishnah. So we have that, and we see in other rabbinic sources that they assume the same kind of lenience. So they identify with the views of the Pharisee regarding law, and they identify with the views of the Pharisees in theological matters such as resurrection, such as the God's providence, the nature of divine providence. So my view is that they really were committed to this tradition. And the idea of tradition of the elders is also something that is very strong in rabbinic literature, although it transforms. So basically, they're committed to the Pharisees, but with 2 points that should be added. One is, even if you're committed 100% to some tradition, things are never don't stand, right? And there's a dynamics, and they develop. And by developing these traditions, at some point they can even diverge quite significantly, but it's based on their interpretation and their commitment to this specific stream of Jewish tradition. That's one thing. The second thing is that the Pharisees were not, they were not, as a movement, they were not priests, and their legal knowledge was very, I would say, weak regarding the temple. They actually were not involved inside the temple itself, and therefore we can find rabbinic sources regarding the temple that do not derive from the Pharisaic tradition. There probably were other texts and other traditions regarding the temple that the rabbis used when they developed their own teachings. Now, on the sociological level, here comes a very important point. These groups were different because social structures changed radically during the first century. So you can talk about You can talk about a group, a social organization, as long as the social structure is basically stable. Once social structures change radically, and they already start to break down in the Herodian period, so that's why at some point they don't identify as Pharisees, they identify as rabbis. Now, this is a very interesting thing. I'm now working on an article exactly on this point. When this shift happened, I think it happened before the destruction of the temple. I think so because of the Gospels. In the Gospels, we have Matthew referring explicitly to the fact that the Pharisees and the scribes were called rabbi, right? And in competition with Jesus. And also that's Matthew, and also Luke calls them nomodidaskaloid, teachers of the law. So you see here like a new kind of social status of teachers. So moving away from the classical structures into new structures. So this is really a dynamic thing, but it does not change the basic commitment of these specific people to this Pharisaic tradition.
So actually, I mean, and reading your book in English, I've been on the fence for a long time with this hyphenation, Pharisees and Rabbis. I've gone back and forth, and now that I've read your book, the English version, I think you're persuading me to
Thanks.
highlight the continuity with between rabbinic text, rabbinic literature, and the Pharisees, so that we could add a fourth source, right? As you already mentioned, to our database about Pharisees, namely the earliest strata of
Exactly.
rabbinic literature. Because as you just said, in the Mishnah, in some sections like the tractate Yadayim, which deals with purity laws, we have rabbis such as Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was operating after 70, uh, um, uh, explaining and siding with laws of Pharisees. So that's very interesting. There's also the resurrection, which you pointed out in passing right now during conversation. But if I'm not mistaken, in your book, you didn't mention the resurrection, and it was something I was going to ask you anyways. What about the resurrection? That could be another connecting point between Pharisees and rabbis, because resurrection is affirmed in rabbinic Judaism. Pharisees are known for that. So in some ways, I don't know what you think of Joseph Seaver's and Amy Jill Levine's book. You were a contributor to this volume, very successful volume, The Pharisees, which was published by Erdman's in 2021, where Joseph Seavers repeats a statement he made decades ago. I just will quote him here. We know considerably less about the Pharisees than we earlier knew, end of quote, which kind of expresses a zeitgeist or I don't know if it's a consensus, but definitely a position that consolidated in recent decades that it's really hard to know much about the Pharisees because we have very little literature written by Pharisees. I mean, sure, Josephus may have dabbled or flirted with Pharisaism, but he was a priest, right? Uh, Paul, to what extent we can say he remained a Pharisee is a controversial question because he became a follower of Jesus, a movement that was emergent. The Essenes weren't Pharisees. And so if we identify the sectarian documents of Qumran with the Essenes, they weren't Pharisees. So we don't have really anything written by a Pharisee. But you seem to think, you believe that through the study of purity laws in particular, because that's what your book is about, a careful analysis of purity laws in the Second Temple literature and earliest rabbinic documents, such as the Mishnah, we can learn at least one central aspect about the Pharisaic worldview. And maybe I'll append to this the follow-up question because it has to deal with something you've been dealing with already, which is namely the Mishnah uh, or other early rabbinic documents that are attributed to the Tanaim. So Tanaim, for our audience, are rabbinic sages who lived roughly during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. The Mishnah is viewed as the earliest document, and it contains these teachings of Tanaim. Some people, famously like Jacob Neusner, later, at least in his very productive scholarship, claimed that we can't sift through the Mishnah, even though the Mishnah contains all these teachings attributed to Tanaim. It's not possible to identify the different literary strata or layers, and we can only talk about the Mishnah in its final redacted form as a composition. He said, the Judaism of the Mishnah. So you, however, have a different approach, and I'd like you to maybe explain why you think it's possible, actually, through the study of purity laws, to identify within the Mishnah earlier strata from later strata.
Okay, so I'll divide this question into two,
Yeah.
and or progress within because it's actually two questions here. And so maybe I'll start with the general issue, the refutal of Neusner's famous approach. Now, this first thing I should say that there are many differences within the rabbinic scholarship, right? There's you can describe Israeli scholarship and American scholarship. There are important differences. Yet I think that in general, it's it's not Neusner's approach within rabbinic scholarship is generally dismissed, and because he became very extreme, and I think he's known outside of rabbinical circles and is used because he's very accessible. I won't forget my experience when I was in Princeton looking for in the library looking for materials in rabbinic, and I saw that all of the library of rabbinic scholarship was Neusner. So I understand his impact, but it's important to note that if you one site for insiders, it's not taken as or his theory is not accepted. What is his theory? I'll say in one sentence just to understand the kind of tension that we're in, because what he argues is, look, if you don't have any external evidence about something, right? So there's no way to analyze it. So what do you have? You have the text. So only the thing that you have is the literary product. Okay? So you have the Mishnah is a literary product, the Tosefta is a literary product. Each rabbinic sources is a literary product in itself. Now, once we also we see that is very generally a homogeneous product. That means that when you read the Mishnah, it's clear when you read the view of Rabbi Akiva and the view of Rabbi Yehoshua, right? Everybody understands that it's not a quotation of Rabbi Akiva or of Rabbi Yehoshua, but it went through a process of I would say standardizing the formulation. And the Mishnah, whoever reads Mishnah, Mishnah is a fantastic text, but it's very clear. It has its own pace, its own style. It's very, on the whole, it's quite unified. That is true. So what Neusner says, look, you look at the Mishnah, it doesn't look like anything around it. It's really a unique text. That's true. There aren't different kinds of genres within it. The Mishnah is its genres for its own. So we must assume that there is a document which was created, and now the next stage would say, and since we don't have way to break it down into different parts, etc., we have to talk about it as a whole, and assume that it has its own philosophy, right? The philosophy of Judaism according to the Mishnah or according to the Tosefta. But the truth is that is a very crude way to describe the Mishnah, because once you start, and that's the first thing, then that is the first step of critical reading of Mishnah and any other Talmudic source. The main feature of rabbinic scholarship is to identify the breaks, the inconsistencies, the tensions within each text and text. That's all what I do, is to show how the Mishnah is a complex text. Now, and that requires, it's true that on a superficial level, it looks very similar. Okay, but once you learn it, you see how much it actually was composed from elements. Now, Nusner agrees. I mean, Nusner understands that, but he dismisses the significance of this aspect when he said, no, we have to look at the final redaction. But why? Why should we do that? Why should we assume that it was redacted very strongly to create a system? It's not systematic. There are tensions, and I can show in every chapter that you can find these tensions, stylistic, structurally, content-wise. And another, the other side of the coin is that there's a significant overlap between the different sources within rabbinic literature. So when you read the Mishnah and Tosefta, we're not talking about two philosophers, each of them writing its own tractate. No, we're talking about shared sources. That's the most simple way to describe it. Shared sources that have variations within the different sources and are woven together in different ways in each of the texts. So now this picture is generally agreed, I think, within rabbinic scholarship. What I said now is nothing here is surprising. I mean, unless you're a newsman. But the question is, how much can we learn from breaking down the text into its basic units? Now, here would come differences between scholars. In general, scholars who are more prone to what we call source criticism will feel more confident to describe the specific source and its original context, right? And scholars that are more careful, that feel that we don't have enough information, not that it cannot be, but we simply don't have enough information to reconstruct the original context of sources, will prefer a more harmonious overlook. And both aspects are correct in that sense. We can talk about the Mishnah at the source, and we can talk about the redaction and it's 100 years later and how it happened. Now, my whole project, whatever I do, whether it's historical issues or literary issues, is to look at the Mishnah as a dynamic text, or to look in rabbinic literature in general as a dynamic source. Now, how can I substantiate the early layers? Okay, so this is a real question. This is a real challenge. Now, the truth be said, that when Nusner presented his critique was I think was very strong, because scholars of my own tradition, I would say, the own Jerusalem tradition of source criticism, were very uncritical. If we look at the main scholar here in Jerusalem, the professor who founded the Jewish studies, Yaakov Nachum Epstein, one of his main books is source criticism of the Mishnah. And I must say, as someone who deals with it all the time, I see his ideas as very, very unfounded. And he has a strong tendency, and here comes the real problem. They really had a strong tendency to associate many, many sources as antique sources, automatic. For instance, every source that mentions the temple, let's say if we take a tractate, example, thinking of tractate Sukkah, on the Feast of Tabernacles. Part of the tractate describes the Feast of Tabernacles in the temple. Now, when was this description? Now, very beautiful descriptions of all the festivals in the temple, and all the lights and
water libations.
Exactly, libation, very important. Now, clearly there is an early source. For instance, they describe a case, the Mishnah, or more the Tosefta brings, and the Tosefta and the Mishnah are very similar, but Tosefta is more clear, describing the case of libation, that a Bophisian priest, which let's say he's like a Sadducee, and we don't know exactly what the group is, but it's associated with the Sadducees, spilled the water on spilled the water on his feet and not on the altar.
Mhm.
Now, the Tosefta says even more, and everybody threw their
Yeah.
etrogim,
Yeah,
their
the etrogs, these are like citrons, like
this
lemon-like
exactly.
fruits.
So because they're all standing in the
Mhm.
temple, they're all excited for this ritual of water, and he despises this ritual, spills the water. Everybody throws their etrogim and even ruin the altar. Now, this story is clearly a variation of a historical story that we know from Josephus.
Right.
Josephus talks about Yanai Alexander, who did exactly that, and that broke into a civil war. So so the Mishnah has remnants,
Mhm.
but of historical knowledge. And so what would Epstein do? Epstein's kind of analysis to identify these kind of fragments and says, if the Mishnah is aware of this point and this point, let's assume that the whole story is historical. But that's not that. So here would come Newsman and say, listen, that's not serious. And I think he's right, and many scholars today would agree that temple descriptions in the Mishnah are not historical, but I think that we've come a long way in developing a more careful, nuanced, sophisticated source analysis that does enable us to isolate early sections that can be compared. And here we return. So if we do this work,
Mhm.
as I demonstrated in this case of this story, or in the we'll go back to the story of the Sadducees and the Pharisees about the Holy Scriptures. What's the next stage? Once I isolated a part and I saw, according to the inner logic of the development, the textual development of the text, I can isolate this as the core, as the earliest layer. Is there a way to substantiate this assumption? And then I go to Second Temple sources. And the amazing thing that I found out when I did that in my work is that many times, once you isolate the earliest layer, it's closer to Qumran and other Second Temple sources than to rabbinic sources themselves. Again, once you assume a tension within rabbinical sources themselves and you isolate a part, then you can compare it both to contemporaneous sources from Second Temple and check it with comparison to later rabbinic sources. And you see both the I would say the early discourse and compare it side by side and see how it developed later on. And that is the method: source criticism and comparison to other sources. Now, it's not the real from that perspective. The real advantage of purity laws is simply that we have a lot of materials from Second Temple. So there's a lot to compare to. In other legal fields, we have so little. It's hard to try and prove the connection or the antiquity of these texts. But in purity, there's so much, and you read Qumran texts and they say, hey, that's exactly in dialogue with ideas of the earliest rabbis.
Yeah, so yeah, yeah, I when you shared your little anecdote about Neusner, I guess I used Neusner as this foil to enter into this discussion. I do recall as a master's student working on my thesis, MA thesis, going to the library in the US, and Neusner was just
Right.
volumes and volumes of Neusner. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is a lot of books, first of all. But then I was very shocked also by his rhetoric, because sometimes he could be quite polemical. That's a tangent right there that we don't need to go into. Some colleagues told me, Neusner's earlier work was better, in their opinion, than his later work. Because in his earlier work, he was trying to sift through and
That's exactly. I really a lot of my work. It's important. It's good that you're mentioning it because I am really thankful for the
Mhm.
kind of work he did on the laws of purity in the 70s.
Right.
In the 70s, he went through all order of purity. So when I prepared my own work and tried to analyze, I used his analysis. Now, at some point, I'll just say that I think he did try to identify layers.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think that he did it not in a sophisticated or subtle manner. But the result, be it as it may, the result was that he gave up. And then the 80s, he just gave up on this kind of endeavor and just viewed the text as a whole and not as a evolution of smaller literary units.
Right, right. Yeah, so just to summarize here for our audience before we move on to the next question, what we have is a debate within Jewish studies about to what extent we can differentiate within the Mishnah layers that come from different generations of rabbis who lived during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. Um, the Mishnah is it's a large corpus. It contains 63 tractates, sections that deal with lots of laws, and many rabbis are named that lived during these 2 centuries. To what extent are these attributions reliable or not? To what extent can we extract earlier layers? If you want to think of this as like a cake, layers of a cake. Well, Neusner, at least in his later scholarship, is like you can't identify. It's just a one-layered cake because the baker has done such a wonderful job in making this
Exactly.
cake, as it were, a unified unit that you can't. The ingredients have been mixed up too much into the cake. But now, with scholars like you, you're saying actually, if we do a careful analysis, critical, we're not going to be naive as much as previous scholarship. And in particular, if we look at the discussions in the Mishnah and other rabbinic texts that were written around the Mishnah's time, so the Tosefta, a cousin of the Mishnah of sorts, in particular, when we look at purity, because there are so many discussions about purity in the Mishnah, and we're blessed also to have lots of material about purity in Second Temple sources, particularly like in Qumran, but also the Hebrew Bible, etc. We can actually identify, we can do a stratification here with purity laws. And what's really exciting is you've discovered, Yair, that some of these earliest strata within the Mishnah, they're closer with the Second Temple ideas about purity than the later strata in rabbinic literature that's going to continue on into the Talmud, etc., post 70 CE. So hopefully that helps our audience understand a little bit. You'll just have to read Yair Furstenberg's book for more details. Moving on to another question now. So what was particular about Pharisaic approaches to purity
Yeah.
at the end of the day? Now that you've done this very careful analysis, what's the takeaway? What did you find unique about the Pharisees and their purity laws?
Fantastic. Thank you. First thing, the mere importance of purity is already something to mention because later rabbinic tradition marginalized purity as a major aspect of everyday life. And it was assumed that purity is necessary only when you come to the temple. If you read all commentators from all this generations, that's the assumption, and that is actually an idea that is developed later on in rabbinic sources, again, because the reality changed. There was at some point the social changes and just the ability to maintain purity and the knowledge of purity became so remote. So this way of life collapsed. It's a gradual, and you can see that again within the Mishnah itself. Or just to take a general, very simple, minimal example, and this time not comparing within the Mishnah, but taking the Mishnah assumes that the rabbis at least are what we call associates, chaverim. Chaverim is a specific name for those who observe purity. Observe purity on a daily basis. That means that when they come to eat supper, they would wash their whole body before eating because they want to eat. their daily food, not anything holy, not
Mhm.
sacrificial food. They're going to eat it in purity. Now, those who do not maintain such a level of observance are called in rabbinic sources Am Haaretz, literally the people of the land. And this distinction between the pure chaver, associate, or the pure parush, Pharisee, and the impure Am Haaretz, person of the, is actually an idea that goes back to the beginning of the Second Temple. If we read the book of Ezra, we see that Ezra calls those that live in the land impure, right? And Ezra, as famously, I mean, there's a lot of what he does is to isolate a specific Judean group as a pure group. Now, this idea continues, and so in early rabbinic literature, it's assumed that we, the rabbis, or that are maintaining purity. But as you follow later sources, and it's explicit in the Talmud, that a rabbi says about himself that would be awkward in earlier sources, I am an Am Haaretz, right? I mean, purity-wise, I am like a person that is the Am Haaretz who does not observe purity. This is some kind of statement that would not be possible in earlier layers. So observance. So what is the major? So what is the major feature of the Pharisees, in my view, following their name and following the laws of purity, is the attempt to maintain purity on a daily basis, not only in the temple. So now, this sounds a very extreme notion. This sounds, when we talk about people that are maintaining purity, we automatically imagine a very sectarian group isolating themselves completely in order to be pure, and any kind of contact with others is something that we cannot stand. But if we go back to hand washing as an example, we can actually understand more deep in a deeper manner how do they understand the observance of purity? Because it's important to remember that everybody wanted to be pure. All go text by text in Second Temple literature, purity is an ideal everybody shares. Also, Jesus shares that. John the Baptist, Jesus, and of course, Qumran sectarians and the temple priests, everybody shares the will to be pure. The only question is, what does that mean? And everybody interprets it differently. So, what is the specific? So again, the shared discourse of Second Temple literature is the assumption that we want to be pure on a daily basis. But now within this discourse, what is a unique take of the Pharisees? This the idea is accessibility to purity. So to be pure is a religious quality. You want to be pure, that puts you on a higher religious status. But if that is a good thing, we want as many people to have access to this kind of activity. So we're not dismissing purity because it's important to us. But on the other hand, we're gonna do compromises in order to enable such access to purity. For example, hand washing. So hand washing is not a more strict practice, but we have to compare it to the purist. Hand washing is actually a way, and within a larger context of halachic details, it's a lenient way to purify yourself before you eat supper. You don't have to immerse your whole body. It's enough to wash your hands in order to get to the relevant degree of purity that you need for daily food. Another example is a stream of water, right? We mentioned the stream of water, right? Now think, if you want to be pure, so there are two possibilities. Either you take the system very strictly, and then you have to move away from Jerusalem because there's no way to maintain it in purity, right? Or you find ways around it, and you say, no, it's okay if as long as the source of purity is below, right, in your own sink, right, and it is below the source of the water, so you can continue using the source of the water. For instance, so that is a dispute. So the Pharisees, in order to give access to some kind of sense of daily practice of purity, so they lower the standards. That is a very important point. Now, this point is not only in purity, it's also in, we mentioned the divorce, right? The Pharisees are allowed divorce. And Jesus says, Moses gave you divorce because of your, how did you say, your hard necks, right?
Right.
Um,
Your stiff-neckedness.
your stiff necks, right? So
Right.
because if you allow divorce, that's giving in to human weaknesses, right? The Pharisees accept human weakness. We're not ideal. We're not living in the Garden of Eden with the way it's described, with a male and a female, and he makes them one flesh. That's an ideal, but we live in the real world, and in the real world, you need compromise. So on the one hand, the way to do it, they're trying to enhance a practice of the law, but they provide a much more humane, a much more accessible form of it. And I'll add another one example, and that is the issue of social contact. Because and here's one thing that excited me when I worked on the book, is to see that again, Qumran and the rabbis share the same basic foundation, basic notion of purity, but the distinction between them is within this framework. So, and in Qumran and in early rabbinic sources, there's the idea of someone that is outside your specific social framework or social group cannot purify himself. In Qumran, there's a very harsh formulation. Whoever does not abide to the covenant of the sect cannot purify. He can go into waters as much as he wants, but it won't help him. He can be sprinkled by purifying waters, but that won't help him. He is pure, impure. It's a very strong text saying that purification that everybody wants is first and foremost a matter of affiliation. You want to be pure, you have to affiliate with the group of covenanters. Now, the rabbis actually, the Pharisees actually say a very similar thing. It appears in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if you are pure, if you go into a immersion pool and you purify yourself, but you are not associated. Chazakah is the Hebrew term. You're not acknowledged as belonging to this group. You cannot purify yourself. So you see a similar legal principle. In Qumran, it becomes this very harsh, extreme ideological statement. In the rabbinic, it's a basic principle, but you can, through a simple process, relatively become an associate, right? So you see, they're starting from the same point, from a Second Temple sectarian discourse of purity, but the Pharisees develop it into something much more accessible.
And I'm thinking of like the word you used earlier, paradox, to explain the Pharisees, because on the one hand, it seems like they're expansive. They want to incorporate more purity practices into daily life, but accommodating, right? So expansive, but we compromise, flexibility, and so forth. Many people would be very curious, I think, to learn about your treatment of the New Testament text, in particular the controversy over hand washing, which you've already alluded to, that is reported in Matthew and in Mark. There, Jesus clashes with the Pharisees, or they clash with one another over this issue. The disciples of Jesus don't wash before they eat. The Pharisees, they ask Jesus, why do your disciples not wash before you eat? You've written a very influential article on this that has really impacted New Testament scholarship. So I'd like to ask you here, just to take opportunity on this podcast, to tell us, what do these gospel texts teach us about Jesus's approach to purity, as well as the Pharisees' own understanding on this matter?
Yeah. I must say that I really feel blessed that I stumbled upon this text, and I wrote this article still in my graduate studies, because I wrote my MA thesis on hand washing, and I was a scholar of rabbinics. I wasn't exposed to New Testament studies, and I was interested in one thing. I was interested in understanding the development of rabbinic law. That was my issue. Now you get to some point, you analyze, and you get to some point where you can't move to you feel that there's something behind it, and you don't understand it. So it happened to me when there's a discussion between two early rabbis, regarding the fact that when you eat something impure, you yourself become impure, not the body. Now, and they discuss the details of this law. So they both assume it, something that doesn't appear at all in this. In this form, does not appear in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, but is assumed by the rabbis, and it becomes a major element. And I try to understand it, and I try to think of the legal principles, and you see, you're stuck within rabbinic discourse because it's already a very sophisticated, very developed, like legalistic discourse. But you feel that you can't touch the point. So as I was working on hand washing, because this section has to do also with hand washing, so I studied Second Temple sources. Again, Qumran doesn't have anything on hand washing, but the Gospels, the Mark 7 and Matthew 15, and also Luke 11, but that's a secondary source. Right. So suddenly you read a text, and just think of it. You suddenly read an external perspective that explains the matter much better than an internal perspective, the detailed rabbinic discourse, because someone is there to look from the outside and say, hey, there is the reason you're doing all this is for this reason. Mm-hmm. Now, this is something that the rabbis themselves would never articulate, because they may even not even know the reason, because they're already inside the system. Mm-hmm. And I understood, that was like an amazing eye-opener, because I understood that sometimes an external perspective is much better and gives you much more, and that's why we cannot, and that's why I tell our students, you want to learn rabbinic law, you have to look outside, because there are limitations from this internal perspective. So, regarding the issue of hand washing, there's a lot to say, but I'll just say my main point. So the Pharisees, it's a complex unit, right, but we'll focus on the issue of hand washing itself. So the Pharisees complain that Jesus' disciples don't wash their hands. So after dismissing their care for their concern for the tradition of the elders, he gives a direct argument, which is, right, and I'm not going to go exactly into what the wording are, because it's significant and there's differences, but in general, what he says, it's not important to wash your hands, because what goes in the body defiles it, but what goes out of the body defiles it. Because what goes in, and then his disciples ask for an explanation, and then he adds, and he says, what goes into the body cannot defile it, because it goes out in the bathroom. Does not really influence you. But what goes out of the body, such as bad thoughts, such as lust, just various things, those are the things that defile the body. So and then Mark, I'll just add, Mark adds, thus, in a very peculiar statement, but at least if we consider the tradition of interpretation, thus he, meaning maybe Jesus, purified all foods. That's the way. So when you read Gospel of Mark, this unit as a whole, you get the impression that the Pharisees complain, why don't they wash their hands? And he answers something that seems irrelevant, because what he says, not what goes, so what you eat does not defile you. But we're not talking about the impurity of what you eat. We're talking about hand washing. How is that connected? But then comes the third stage where it seems as what he's saying in general, what does it matter what you eat? I mean, nothing really influences the body. Nothing physical really influences the body. Eat whatever you want. Eat pork, right? Because he purified all foods. That's the way this text was understood. So it starts from a very specific issue of hand washing, and the debate expands, and suddenly it ends with a general statement of who cares of purity in general? Purity ritual is not important. The only thing that is important is moral impurity. Now, we don't have enough time, I think, but this distinction between ritual purity and moral impurity is a very important distinction in mapping the views of purity in Second Temple period. So many commentators didn't really go into the details of the discussion. What was important for them was the conclusion. What Jesus cared for was only moral purity. So we can do whatever you want. You can wash your hands or not wash your hands. Whatever physically you're going to do is not important, but your behavior, your thoughts, are more important. Now, that could be right for some layer within this tradition, right? But it does not explain this precise answer that Jesus gave the Pharisees. So again, within the same kind of work on source criticism, trying to peel off later additions, such as the statement that he purified all foods, because that's clearly not what he did. He did not say that you can eat not kosher foods. This was emphasized in the book of Daniel Boyarin on Jesus. He said, right, Jesus ate kosher. Now that's clear. This is not an innovation. I think everybody would agree about that. The innovation was to read more precisely Jesus' response as as assuming that he really understands the Pharisees that he's talking to. Right. He really understands their concerns, and he has a strong argument against their concerns. Right. So what are their concerns? So here we can reconstruct the kind of the original discussion and actually show, and this is what's important, that Jesus is not saying something against the law. This was a crucial point. But Jesus' response, again, I'm not talking about the addition by Mark, but Jesus' response itself, not what goes into your body defiles it, but what goes out of your body defiles it. This is a response that is internal response, an internal Jewish response, which is actually describes very well the biblical purity system. So you have the rabbis demanding hand washing. Jesus says your hand washing has this. You have a specific purity reason that you think one should wash his hand, but this does not fit the principles of biblical purity laws. Right. So Jesus, in fact, like he does in other places, proves a very good knowledge of details of law, and actually he reflects a more, I would call it, conservative view. So I'll say a few sentences about the issue itself. And here, I think hand purity really reflects or embodies the basic views about purity among Second Temple Judaism. Why did the rabbis care about hand washing? And this is something, or the Pharisees, again, and this is something you don't learn from later rabbinic sources, because you need a general external view. So why do they care? Why do they wash their hands? So if we read Jesus's response, we understand that they wash their hands in order not to defile the food that they're holding. And why do they care not to defile the food that they're holding? Because if you digest an impure food, you yourself become impure. So the Pharisees are concerned, I would call it, the Pharisees are, as I mentioned before, are creating, are offering a daily practice of purity, daily foods. Why? Because what are they concerned for? They're not concerned about the temple. You're far away from the temple. What is the thing that you're trying to maintain, or what is the thing that you're trying to maintain I would say not its sanctity, but it's you don't want to compromise.
Right.
It's your body.
Right.
So, right, like we would feel about eating, right, about eating things that are not in the right quality or that are defiled, that in somewhere they're weakening us. So we create a new focus. So what the rabbis did in order to maintain or to offer this new form of purity practice, which is a daily purity, they also had to give a new rationale. And the new rationale was something that could be very easily that people can very easily associate with. And that is maintaining the integrity of your body, the integrity of yourself. People do not want to digest things that would be not good for them. Now, here Jesus answers very strongly. He says, what you're doing, you're trying to promote purity, but what in fact you're promoting a practice that focuses on the self. And Jesus says, no, you have to, and the Torah is true that the Torah itself does not, Jesus is right. Eating something that was defiled does not defile the body. That's an invention of the Pharisees. That's an invention of later practices, of later traditions. What does the Torah really care for? That you will not defile others. So it's and this encapsulates the ethical approach of Jesus. So it's beautiful because you see how legal issues encapsulate ideologies. So this is the way I, in general, approach Second Temple legal discourse, because I think that it's in such a basic stage of legal development that the disputes between the Pharisees and Jesus and the Sadducees, each of them it's not a detail of law, it's a policy, it's an approach, it's a worldview that is represented through this specific practice.
So I'd like to follow up on that. I know there's a lot we could say. We could have had just a podcast on Jesus hand washing and the Pharisees. But first, and I think you would agree that in the original setting of, say, Mark 7, Matthew 15, where we have this report about hand washing, there is also controversy in Luke 11, although it doesn't talk about hand washing, it just talks about washing. The Pharisees are surprised Jesus doesn't wash. Maybe it's referring to full immersion before he eats. That in the Gospels, they're working under the assumption that we're talking about washing hands before eating kosher food. So food that is permitted for a Jew to eat. So like pita bread, olives, anything that is allowed by Jewish law to eat. Not, let's say, pork, because otherwise the Pharisees would be like, oh my goodness, what are you guys doing? You're eating pork. It doesn't matter whether you wash your hands or don't wash your hands because pork is forbidden by the Mosaic
It's
Torah.
unimaginable by within Jewish society as described in the text.
Right. So that's the working assumption. Now, other thing, like you said, is in the Torah of Moses, so the biblical Torah, so to speak, there is no law requiring Jews, lay Jews, non-priests, to wash their hands before they eat. This seems to be a practice that the Pharisees thought was normative, required, probably stemming from the tradition of the elders. In fact, Jesus then points out, hey, you guys observe the tradition of the elders to such a point that sometimes it compromises, from Jesus' point of view, of course, what's written in the Torah of Moses. Purity discourse, like you said earlier, actually in response to another question, like everybody wanted to be pure during the Second Temple period, and that includes Jesus as well. People were talking about purity. It's in the Bible, throughout the Hebrew Bible. It's in the New Testament as well. Even Paul talks about purity. But then we have, well, since it's used in so many different contexts, what kind of purity are we talking about? Some scholars like to talk about ritual purity versus moral purity. And here's where these categories might be of help here to understand this text. The hand washing might fall within a ritual purity category. You can become impure, for example, if you come in touch with a corpse. That is in the Torah. Then you're impure for 7 days. Women, when they have menstruation, they're impure for 7 days, and other things of that sort that don't really fall in the category of behavior, like moral behavior. It's not a sin to touch a body. You have to even bury a body. That's a responsibility. So this falls into this ritual category. And what Jesus is denying apparently is the idea that if, say, I am ritually impure, I touch, let's say, some challah bread. I'm just making this up, something that a Jew can eat. Um, and then I eat this permitted food. It's not pork or some forbidden food. It's not going to contaminate my body ritually inside, because the body is going to digest this, process this, and this is going to go out into the sewer. It's waste. What you need to really be worried about, Jesus says, is this moral impurity, because the Bible uses purity language to describe behaviors like stealing, greed, adultery, etc. Things that come out of the heart, that are uttered by the mouth, and then that are performed. This is what's going to make you impure. That said, would you agree, Yair, that Jesus is not dismissing the ritual purity laws that are in the Bible? That he would say, yeah, if you come into contact with a corpse, you are impure. He's rejecting a Pharisaic expansion, maybe to use that word, expansion of ritual purity laws. What's your reaction to that comment?
Yes, so sure. What Jesus argues is that by expanding what you think is expanding ritual purity practices, you're actually undermining some basic principles. So this is one thing. So and it's important to remember that the text has two levels, two stages. The basic statement of Jesus has no reference to moral issues. It says a legal statement.
Yeah.
According to the laws of the Torah, right? And actually, even the rabbis would agree with this statement. We even have a very similar statement in a later commentator that says, according to the laws of the Torah, not what goes into the body defiles it, but what goes out of the body can defile. For instance, if an impure person spits, so that defiles others. That's a standard, or urine, or blood, or that could defile. But a person that can even defile other people. But a person cannot be defiled by eating things that are, again, as long as it's kosher. If it's not kosher, that's a different story. But if it's a kosher food cannot defile you. So first thing he says, on one level, he's answering them through a internal legal statement. And this is because it's a shared world of ritual practice, which all of them, and on some level, share, participate in, despite the specific details. Now, what Jesus adds, and this is very nice, this is the greatness of Jesus, is the ability to attach moral implications to ritual practices. So it's not a contrast between ritual purity and moral purity, but it's choosing the right ritual practice which represents the correct moral ideas. Okay, everybody, again, legal practice is a form of ideological discourse. When you're doing something, let's take again matters of divorce. If you're allowing divorce or not allowing divorce, it's a legal question, right? But it's clearly reflecting different images of how we understand humans, how we understand the family structure, how we understand society. We have much larger issues that are related to this. That it's a whole worldview that is linked to this specific question, right? And Jesus is always more, not always, but in these cases, is again strict, is more conservative than the Pharisees and their practices. Now, so he said, he says, on the one level, what you're doing is you're focusing on the wrong point within the ritual practice. You're focusing on something of the impurity of the self, and that is something that the Torah does not care about. And that idea has also a moral implication. You're becoming people that care more about yourselves than about your whoever's around you. And this is, I think, now this is a very deep statement because I can, as an observant Orthodox Jew today, I can really identify with this kind of connection between what we seem to be technical ritual issues and the creation of specific sensitivities, right? Do we have, or are we focused too much on something that Torah tells us, the law tells us, but you're focusing too much through your ritual on something that you're missing the whole point of the law more generally?
The bigger picture. Yeah, maybe two things that I'll just follow up here, and because of time, we're going to unfortunately have to end this exciting discussion. One, am I correct to assume that the Pharisees think that, okay, if I'm ritually impure, so my hands are impure, and then if I touch, let's say, bread, this bread now can become impure, especially if it gets into contact with water. Water can become this like element that spreads impurity. And now the bread is impure. And if I consume this bread, it's internalized, but it's going to contaminate my body. Is that what they're assuming?
Right. So that they're assuming that in general terms, right? We don't want anything impure to penetrate into our body. So but what we see, I started this whole discussion by saying that when you come to rabbinic sources later on, they're already discussing details of the level of specific impurity because he said it goes from your hands to the liquids, to the bread, into your body. So what is the level of impurity? And that has all kinds of implications because a person on one level of impurity cannot touch this, but if it's a lighter, so they're already they're deep into the details, but this basic notion of the ability of food to contaminate the person who eats it is something that is not explained, is assumed but not explained. And the discussion of Jesus and the rabbi and the Pharisees uncovers the basic idea, or even I would even say ideology behind this, or worldview behind this notion.
And so the other thing, it's the last thing that I'll ask for now, unless you want to add anything before we conclude this discussion, is what do you think of Daniel Boyarin's thesis? And now there's a more recent article by Logan Williams that even at the, let's say, redactional level, so the author of the Gospel of Mark, so Mark chapter 7, verse 19, but the last part of verse 19, let's call it 19b, thus declaring or making all foods clean. Boyarin, he would say, well, even Mark is not saying now, so pork, you can eat your pepperoni pizza, you can eat shrimp, you can eat lobster, all of these impure animals that are forbidden, that are non-kosher for Jews to eat. But it's still remaining within the framework of this discussion about ritual purity laws, so that it's like if I touch this bread and my hands are impure, the bread becomes impure, and now I ingest it and I become impure. So that's what the Pharisees are saying. Jesus is saying, no, the body is going to process it, therefore making all foods, kosher foods that were impure, pure. What do you think of that hypothesis?
So I wanted to distinguish between a few elements within this. Boyarin argued this, offered this reading in order to make Mark more Jewish. Now, this is a general issue, which I don't feel any strong need to do that, right? It's okay if his readers are Gentile, if his community are Gentiles. This relates to the history of the specific gospels, and I don't have any general argument, and it's very important for me to say that also when I work. My method is the same. Within Mark, I'm really interested in the earliest layers that could reflect Not Jesus himself. I don't presume to know exactly what it is, but the earliest form of the story, and that's why I'm not sure what I think about this, how to read. But I do want to say that when you read, and I mention it, I think in my work, um, uh, there is a source. I think that it's in Lucian, Lucianus,
Hmm.
that he brings some story. Again, it's like not related to Jewish law at all, but saying something that's someone wanted to steal fruits from a tree, and then the person guarding the place
Right.
say he wanted to send the person away. So he told him, yeah, you should know that there was a corpse on this tree. So he answers, I'm sorry, I don't remember the source. I'm sorry, it's not Lucianus. But whatever. So, but the answer is very interesting. He said, okay, I'll eat the fruit and purify it. He uses the same structure like Mark 19. So you
Interesting.
see that the idea, so here what purifies, it's not Jesus purifies, it's the body as
Hmm.
a form of purification. Now, this has to do with how we read the exact syntax and form of the Greek there in the verse. And that's again a more we can sit with the text itself. But the idea that purification, the body itself is purifying. So this is very interesting because then you see again different approaches towards our body, towards ourselves, right? Should we be afraid? Should we fear pollution? And are we weak, right? And we should be
Hmm.
afraid of our weaknesses and then act accordingly. Or do we view, right, a person as like a source of purity? Now it's very interesting because Jesus himself viewed himself as a source of purity. He purified people. We didn't have time to talk about it, but the fact that he healed people, the fact that he was able to heal, to remove impure spirits, demons,
Right.
and his ability all the sins, right? To remove
Remove
sins of
sins.
people.
Right.
So that is a part of Jesus's mission as a purifier. I always say, how would Jesus define himself? I'm pure. I'm the Holy Spirit coming to purify the world. That's also an idea that we find in Qumran. So the ability to purify is a unique feature of Jesus. But I think what he says is that every person has that ability, if we read the verse in that way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And the syntax in Mark 7 19 is and the verse is right before a bit complicated, but
Right,
you
right.
could read it that way. Therefore, the body has the ability to make things clean. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've we've spent a lot of time together, and so we could prolong this conversation. But I mean, I guess before we go, I'll just ask you two little things. I mean, one, is there anything that you want to add to all of the nice conversation we've had? And then two, are there current future projects that you're working on, and where can people from the general public find out about your research?
Yeah, no, I don't have what to add. I think it was a very good conversation, and but well, there's looking forward to other additional conversations. I think
I hope so.
we'll have opportunities. We opened many windows that could be continued, God willing, in the future. Now, I currently my major project is more rabbinic law within its Roman context.
Mhm.
It's a project called Local Law Under Rome. It's funded by the European Research Commission and ERC. And I have a group here in the Hebrew University thinking of development of Jewish law under Rome in comparison to other local legal practices. I've published on this idea. Now it relates to the issue of Pharisees and the movement from Pharisees to the rabbis in a different angle. The fact that the Pharisees do not really care about issues of civil law, what we call private law, but rather more ritual issues. And when we move on to the Mishnah, we see that they are very much concerned with issues of private law, of courts, of daily business. So what created that shift? My argument in general is the Roman Empire. They're trying to fit into a legal discourse of the Roman Empire. So this is one of many trajectories of development of rabbinic from Pharisees to the rabbis. This is a major issue that I'm concerned with. So I'm now developing this aspect of it. I can maybe mention one article that I wrote. It published in the Journal for the Study of Judaism. From Pharisees, again, you see this, from Pharisees to provincial jurists, something like that. And the idea of suddenly law changes its scope, because we're talking not only about ritual, but also about private law, and that changes Jewish law more generally due to the influence of the Roman environment. Now, one last thing I mentioned, and I'm really working, I'm trying to develop this idea of the shift from the Pharisees to the rabbis on the terminological level. What does it mean when a new group emerges that is considered, or it defines itself through the idea of a personal connection of rabbi, right? That's not a title. A rabbi is my master. It's the way a disciple would turn to his master, to his rabbi. This is a new thing. And what is the background to this new kind of movement, this new kind of practice? It has very significant implications on the nature of rabbinic activity, the nature of rabbinic literary production. So that's another aspect of what I'm doing.
Wow, those are all very fascinating, huge, important topics, and I hope we'll have the opportunity to have you back again at Talmud for Everyone. Everyone, it's been Yair Furstenberg talking today with Talmud for Everyone about his groundbreaking research in his new book published in English, Purity and Identity in Ancient Judaism.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much.